There is a moment coming in your life, maybe it is already here, when no one else will be in the room with you. Not your parents, not your best friend, not the person you love most in this world. You will be standing at the edge of a decision, a diagnosis, a failure, a fear, a grief so heavy it has no name yet. And you will look to your left and to your right, and you will find that the crowd has quietly disappeared. It is just you and the weight of your own life. Most people spend their entire existence terrified of that moment. They build entire personalities around avoiding it, chasing noise, chasing company, chasing distraction, because the silence of being truly alone with yourself feels like standing at the mouth of a cave with no light. But here is what the old Stoics knew, what Marcus Aurelius wrote in a war tent by candlelight, what Epictetus learned in chains, what Seneca understood staring at his own death sentence. That cave is not your enemy. It is your forge. Today we are going to walk through 9 things, 9 specific, unavoidable, deeply human experiences that you cannot outsource, cannot borrow strength for, cannot get anyone else to carry for you. 9 things you must face utterly alone. And if you have the courage to stay with me for the next half hour, I promise you will not just understand why solitude builds strength, you will know exactly how to walk into it without flinching. Stay until the end, because the 9th one is the one nobody talks about, and it might be the most important thing you hear all year. Welcome back to Wisdom of the Stoics, the place where ancient philosophy meets the real battles of modern life. If you are new here, we take the 2,000-year-old teachings of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus and turn them into practical armor for the life you are actually living. So settle in, and if this message finds you at the right time, consider hitting subscribe before we begin, because what we are about to cover might change how you face every hard moment for the rest of your life. Let's start with an uncomfortable truth. Somewhere along the way, we were taught that strength looks like a crowd, that the more people surround us, the safer we are, that a full inbox, a full calendar, a full house means a full life. But the Stoics, men who lived through plagues, exile, betrayal, war, and the daily threat of death by the whim of an emperor, believed almost the opposite. They believed that a person who has never learned to sit with themselves, who has never faced their own mind without an audience, without a phone, without a distraction, is a person who has never actually tested the metal they are made of. Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful man on earth, emperor of Rome, commander of legions, spent his quiet hours not surrounded by advisors, but alone with a journal, interrogating his own soul. He wrote in what we now call Meditations, a passage that could have been written yesterday. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one. He was not writing for an audience. He was writing because he had no one else to say it to. He had to become his own witness, his own judge, his own teacher. That is the thread running through everything we are about to explore. 9 doors, and behind every one of them, you will find yourself standing alone. The question is not whether you will face them. You will, whether you like it or not. The question is whether you walk in prepared, or whether you get dragged in kicking and screaming. So let's open the first door. Before we do, I want to ask you something, and I actually want you to answer honestly in the comments below. When was the last time you were truly alone with your thoughts? No phone, no music, no scrolling, for even 10 minutes. Type your answer. I read every one, and I promise you, by the end of this video, that number is going to matter. You must face the silence of your own mind. There is a peculiar kind of fear that modern life has manufactured, one that our ancestors would have found almost incomprehensible. The fear of silence. Walk into any waiting room and watch what happens the instant a person sits down. The phone comes out before the body has even settled into the chair. Stand in an elevator and observe the reflexive reach for a screen, as if 10 seconds of unfilled time were an emergency, to be managed rather than a gift to be received. We have engineered a world so saturated with noise that the human mind, which spent hundreds of thousands of years learning to sit with Itself around fires, in fields, on long walks between villages, has almost forgotten how. Seneca saw the seeds of this 2,000 years ago, and he had a name for it. He called it a disease of restlessness, a soul running from itself. In his letters to his friend Lucilius, he described people who travelled from city to city, from villa to villa, convinced that a change of location would cure their unhappiness, only to discover that wherever they went, they brought themselves along. "You need a change of soul, not a change of climate," he wrote, because the noise was never outside them. It was a strategy to avoid what was inside. Here is why this matters so much for the topic of strength. Every single hard decision you will ever make in your life, everyone eventually has to be made in silence. You can ask for advice. You can gather opinions from 10 different people who love you. But when the moment actually arrives to choose, to commit, to act, the room empties out and it is just you, alone with your own judgment. If you have never practiced sitting with that judgment, if every quiet moment of your life has been filled with someone else's voice, a podcast, a group chat, a television left on for company, then the first time you are forced into true silence will not feel like clarity. It will feel like drowning. I want you to think about Marcus Aurelius again for a moment, because his situation makes this almost unbearably vivid. Here was a man commanding the largest empire on the face of the earth, and at night, in a tent on the frontier of the Danube, fighting wars he never wanted, burying friends and children he had lost to plague. He sat with a blank page and wrote to no one but himself. Not for publication, not for praise. He wrote because he needed a place to think without the noise of the court, without the flattery of senators, without the expectations of an empire pressing in on him. His journal was, in the truest sense, an exercise in facing silence, and it produced one of the most quietly powerful books ever written. A book that still, 2 millennia later, is helping people like you and me get through our own hard nights. So how do you actually build this muscle? Not by forcing yourself into some dramatic week-long retreat with no talking. That is not realistic for most lives. And honestly, it is not even necessary. Strength is built in small, repeated doses. Start with this. Once a day, sit somewhere without your phone for 5 minutes. Not meditating in some perfect mystical sense, just sitting. Let your mind wander. Notice what it wanders toward. Notice what thoughts you have been avoiding by keeping yourself busy. That avoided thought. That is usually where the real work is waiting. There is something almost frightening about this practice at first, and I want to be honest with you about that. Instead of pretending it is peaceful from day one, when you remove the noise, the mind does not go quiet immediately. It gets louder. All the things you have been running from, the argument you never resolved, the choice you have been postponing, the grief you buried under work, they surface. This is not a malfunction. This is the process working exactly as it should. The Stoics did not believe in numbing the mind into blankness. They believed in confronting it, examining it, and slowly, through repetition, becoming someone who is no longer afraid of what their own thoughts have to say. Epictetus, who began his life as a slave with no control over his own body, understood something profound about this inner territory. He taught that while the external world could be taken from you, your freedom, your possessions, even your limbs, your judgment, your inner citadel could never be touched by anyone but you. But here is the catch. That inner citadel only becomes a fortress if you actually go inside it and reinforce the walls. Ignore it, and it stays a ruin. Visit it daily, sit with its silence, and slowly, brick by brick, it becomes the safest place you own. If you are watching this and thinking, I don't have time to sit in silence, my life is too full, I would gently push back. You have time. What you may not have yet is the tolerance for the discomfort that silence brings. And that tolerance is exactly what we are building here, together, one video at a time. If this is resonating with you so far, drop a comment with the number one distraction you reach for to avoid silence. For a lot of people it's the phone. but I've heard everything from television to overworking to constant socializing. Naming it is the first step to facing it. Because once you can sit in silence without flinching, something remarkable happens. You stop needing external validation to know what you think. You stop needing a crowd to tell you who you are. And that, more than any productivity hack or motivational quote, is the foundation every other kind of strength in this video is going to be built on. You must face your own failures without an audience to soften the blow. Let's talk about failure, not the curated, Instagram caption version of failure that gets turned into a redemption story after the fact, but the raw, unglamorous version. The version where you are lying awake at 2 a.m. replaying the moment it fell apart, and there is no one there to tell you it's going to be okay. Here is something that rarely gets said honestly. The people around you can comfort you after a failure, but they cannot metabolize it for you. Your best friend can say all the right things. Your parents can remind you that they love you regardless. But the actual internal work of taking a failure apart, understanding what went wrong, deciding what it means about you and what it does not mean about you, that surgery happens in one operating room only, and you're the only surgeon allowed inside. Seneca lost everything more than once in his life. He was exiled to Corsica for 80 years on charges that were likely politically motivated, stripped from Roman society, separated from his family, left on an island with nothing but his own mind for company. Imagine that, one of the great minds of the ancient world, exiled from every conversation, every debate, every piece of intellectual community that had defined his identity. He had every reason to collapse into self-pity. Instead, in his letters and essays from that period, we see him doing something extraordinary. He faced the failure of his political life head-on, without an audience, and used the isolation to refine his understanding of what actually mattered. He concluded, painfully and honestly, that his sense of self had been too tightly wound around his status, his position, his public identity, and that this exile, as brutal as it was teaching him to locate his worth somewhere sturdier. This is the pattern you will notice again and again with the Stoics. They did not treat failure as a wound to be hidden from view. They treated it as material, raw, painful, unwanted material, but material nonetheless, material that could be shaped into wisdom. If you were willing to sit with it, honestly, instead of rushing to explain it away to everyone around you. Here is why facing failure alone matters so much for building actual strength. When you immediately run to other people after a failure, not for comfort, which is healthy, but for validation, for someone to tell you it wasn't your fault, for someone to absorb the discomfort so you don't have to sit in it, you rob yourself of the one thing that turns failure into growth: honest self-examination. It is far easier to let a friend tell you it wasn't your fault than to sit alone and ask yourself the much harder question: what part of this actually was mine to own? What did I do or fail to do that contributed to this outcome? That question only gets answered in solitude, because the moment another person is in the room, some part of you starts performing for them instead of investigating for yourself. Marcus Aurelius wrote extensively about this kind of self-accounting. He believed in what philosophers now call a nightly examination of conscience, going back over the events of the day alone and asking honestly, where did I act well? And where did I fall short? Not to punish himself, but to correct course. This is not self-flagellation. It is closer to what a craftsman does when a piece of work comes out wrong. They don't scream at the wood. They don't need an audience to witness their frustration. They simply turn the piece over in their hands, alone, and figure out what needs to change for the next attempt. I think about this every time I hear someone say, I just need to talk it through with someone. Sometimes that's true. We are social creatures, and there is real value in processing pain with people who love us. But I want you to notice the difference between processing and outsourcing. Processing with a friend after you have already done your own quiet reckoning is healthy. Immediately reaching for someone else's opinion before you've sat with the failure yourself is often a way of avoiding the discomfort of your own judgment. And the sad irony is, the more you avoid that discomfort, the weaker your judgment becomes over time, because it is a muscle, and muscles that are never used waste away. Let me give you something practical here, because I don't want this to just be philosophy floating in the air. I want you to be able to use it tonight if you need to. The next time you fail at something, a project falls apart, a relationship ends badly, you make a mistake at work that costs you something real. Before you call anyone, before you post anything, before you seek a single external opinion, give yourself 24 hours of solitary reflection. Write down, honestly, in a private journal, 3 things: what happened, what part of it was within your control, and what part was not. This exercise alone, done consistently, will build a kind of internal steadiness that no amount of outside reassurance can give you, because reassurance from others is borrowed, and what you build in solitude is owned. If you have ever felt embarrassed about a failure, genuinely embarrassed, the kind that makes you want to disappear, I want you to know that every single person whose wisdom we study on this channel felt that too. Epictetus was a slave who was, according to some accounts, physically disabled by a master who broke his leg. Seneca was exiled and later forced to take his own life by an emperor he had once tutored. Marcus Aurelius buried multiple children and ruled during a plague that killed millions. None of them were strangers to devastating failure and loss. What separated them was not the absence of failure. It was their willingness to sit alone with it, examine it honestly, and let it refine rather than define them. If this section is hitting home for you, I'd genuinely love to know, what is one failure you're still carrying that you've never fully sat with alone? You don't have to share the details in the comments if it's too personal, but even just typing "I have one" helps you acknowledge it exists. Half the battle with facing failure alone is simply admitting there is something there to face. You must face grief without anyone able to carry it for you. There is no gentle way into this next one, so let's not pretend there is. Grief is perhaps the most isolating experience a human being can go through, precisely because it cannot be shared in the way we wish it could be. People will stand beside you at a funeral. They will bring meals to your house in the weeks after a loss. They will send messages, make calls, sit with you in silence. All of that matters. I want to be clear that community around grief is not meaningless, and the Stoics never argued that we should face loss with cold detachment or refuse comfort from others. But here is the truth that no casserole or condolence card can change the specific shape of your loss. The particular hole it leaves in your particular life is something only you inhabit. No one else lost exactly what you lost, loved exactly how you loved, or will carry the absence in exactly the way you will carry it. Marcus Aurelius knew this kind of grief intimately, and in a way that should humble anyone who has ever complained that life is unfair. Historical records suggest he lost at least 8 of his children before adulthood. 8. Think about that number for a moment. Not one tragedy, but a repeated, grinding, relentless series of losses that would break most people entirely. And yet he continued to rule, to write, to search for meaning, alone with a grief that none of his advisors, none of his generals, not even his wife, could fully enter with him. In his meditations, Marcus doesn't rage against the unfairness of it. Instead, he returns again and again to a way of thinking that modern grief research would later validate. He reminds himself that everything he loves is on loan from nature, and that nature has the right to reclaim what it gave. This was not coldness. This was Marcus, alone with his own devastation, doing the only work that could actually be done, building a framework strong enough to hold the weight of loss without collapsing under it. I want to be very careful here, because I think grief is one of the places where philosophy can accidentally sound dismissive if it's not handled with care. The Stoics have sometimes been misread as saying, "Don't feel sad," as if the goal is emotional numbness. That is not what they taught, and it's not what I'm teaching you here. Seneca himself, in his letters of consolation to grieving friends, acknowledged the reality of pain. He wrote to comfort a mother who had lost her son, and he did not tell her that her grief was irrational or that she should simply stop feeling it. What he offered instead was a companion for the loneliness of grief, the idea that grief, faced honestly and alone, has a natural process, and that trying to rush past it or suppress it with constant distraction only prolongs the suffering. This is the part I really want you to sit with. In our modern world, we have become remarkably skilled at helping people avoid grief rather than face it. We keep ourselves busy after a loss. We throw ourselves back into work within days. We fill every quiet evening with television. So the silence doesn't force us to feel what's underneath. And I understand why. That silence when grief is fresh can feel unbearable. But here is what the Stoic approach teaches us. The grief does not disappear because you outran it. It waits. It resurfaces, often at the worst possible moments, precisely because it was never actually processed, only postponed. Facing grief alone does not mean facing it without support. It means, at some point, giving yourself permission to sit with the loss directly, without a screen, without a task, without a distraction, and simply let yourself feel the full weight of what is gone. This is one of the hardest things a human being can do, and I will not pretend otherwise. But it is also, paradoxically, the thing that allows grief to eventually soften rather than calcify into something that quietly poisons every part of your life it touches. There's a practice worth mentioning here, one that comes up throughout Stoic writing in different forms. The idea of acknowledging impermanence before loss happens, not to become emotionally detached, but to deepen your appreciation while you still have what you have. Marcus Aurelius often reminded himself, while embracing his children, that he might not have them tomorrow, not as a morbid exercise, but as a way of experiencing the present moment with full awareness of its preciousness. This is sometimes called memento mori, and we will return to it later in this video, because it touches almost every one of the 9 things we're covering today. If you are watching this and currently in the middle of grief, recent or old, a loss you have never fully processed, I want to pause and speak directly to you for a moment. You are not weak for how heavy this feels. The heaviness is not a sign that you are handling it wrong. It is a sign of how much that person, that relationship, that chapter of your life actually meant. The Stoics do not ask you to feel less. They ask you to face what you feel honestly, in your own time, without shame, and to trust that on the other side of that honest facing is a strength you cannot access any other way. If this section moves something in you, take a moment wherever you are and just breathe. And if you're comfortable, let me know in the comments if there's someone this video reminds you of, someone you're grieving, or someone you're grateful you still have. Sometimes just writing their name is its own small act of facing it. You must face your fears without someone else taking the first step for you. Fear has a peculiar social trick it plays on us. We often believe that having someone beside us dissolves fear entirely, and to some degree in the moment it can soften the edges. But there is a category of fear that no amount of company can actually resolve, because the resolution requires an action only you can take. Think about the fears that actually shape a life. The fear of starting a business that might fail publicly. The fear of leaving a relationship that is comfortable but wrong. The fear of speaking an unpopular truth in a room full of people who disagree with you. The fear of trying something you might not be good at, in front of people who will watch you try. In every one of these cases, other people can encourage you, cheer for you, even stand nearby, but the actual step, the actual leap, has to be taken by your own 2 feet, alone, regardless of how many supporters are standing at the edge with you. Epictetus taught something that feels almost radical when you first encounter it. He argued that fear is not caused by the things we fear, but by our judgments about those things. Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things, he wrote. This might sound like a small philosophical distinction, but it has enormous practical weight. It means the raw material of fear, the actual event you're afraid of, is often less powerful than the story you have built around it in your own mind, alone, in the privacy of your own thoughts. And here is the crucial implication. If fear is built in the privacy of your own mind, it also has to be dismantled there. You cannot borrow someone else's courage the way you might borrow a tool. You can be inspired by their courage. You can learn from how they approached a similar fear. But the actual dismantling of your specific fear, examining it, testing whether your catastrophic predictions are actually true, deciding to act despite the discomfort, happens in a mental space no one else can enter. There's a story about Cato the Younger that has always struck me as a perfect illustration of facing fear alone. Cato, a Roman statesman known for his uncompromising commitment to his principles, found himself on the losing side of a civil war against Julius Caesar. Rather than submit to Caesar's rule, which he saw as a betrayal of the republic he had spent his life defending, Cato chose to take his own life. The details of his final night are almost unbearable to read. He spent hours alone, reading philosophy, specifically Plato's dialogue on the immortality of the soul, preparing his mind for what he was about to do. He asked to be left alone repeatedly. His friends and family, terrified of what he intended, tried to stay near him, tried to remove his sword. But Cato insisted on facing this, the most consequential decision of his life, without an audience managing his emotions for him. I share this story not to dwell on its tragic ending, but because of what it reveals about the nature of facing fear. Even a man surrounded by loyal friends who loved him deeply understood that the final reckoning with his own convictions had to happen in solitude. No one could do that internal work for him. No one could hand him courage the way you might hand someone a cup of water. Now let's bring this down from ancient Rome to something more immediate. Think about the last time you avoided doing something because you were afraid, not of physical danger, but of judgment, of failure, of the unknown. Maybe it was sending an email that could change your career. Maybe it was having a conversation that could end or transform a relationship. Maybe it was simply starting something you have wanted to do for years, but have talked yourself out of every single time. In every one of these moments, the fear lived in your head privately, and no external circumstance was going to walk in and dissolve it for you. You had to choose to act despite it alone, in the specific moment where courage was required. Here's a practical Stoic technique that can help with this, one that Seneca described, and that modern psychology has since validated in different forms. Premeditatio malorum, or the premeditation of adversity. Before facing something you fear, sit alone and honestly walk through the worst realistic outcome. Not the catastrophized, spiraling worst case that your anxious mind might generate at 3 a.m., but the actual realistic worst outcome. Then ask yourself, could I survive that? Could I rebuild from that? In nearly every case, when you sit with this question honestly, alone, without anyone softening the answer for you, you discover that the worst realistic outcome is survivable. And once you know from your own honest examination that you could survive the worst case, the fear loses much of its paralyzing grip. This is not a technique that works if someone else does it for you. If your friend tells you you'll be fine, it might comfort you for a moment, but it doesn't build the same internal conviction as arriving at that conclusion yourself through your own honest reasoning. That's the difference between borrowed confidence and earned confidence, and only one of them holds up under real pressure. I want to ask you something, and I'd love an honest answer in the comments. What is the fear you have been circling for months, maybe years, without taking the first step? You don't need to explain the whole situation, just naming it, even briefly, is itself a small act of facing it alone, in a space where you get to decide what you do next. You must face the opinions of others without needing them to change. Here is one of the most liberating and most difficult truths in all of Stoic philosophy. You will never control what other people think of you. And the sooner you stop trying, the sooner you become genuinely strong. This sounds simple when you first hear it. Of course we can't control other people's opinions. Everyone nods along. But watch how differently people actually behave. Watch how much energy goes into managing perception, into crafting the right image, into worrying about what was said in a room after we left it, into rehearsing conversations we're afraid to have because of how the other person might react. If we truly believed we couldn't control others' opinions, why would so much of our emotional life be organized around trying? Epictetus built an entire philosophical system around a single, foundational distinction. Some things are within our control, and some things are not. Our judgments, our choices, our efforts, our attitudes, these are ours. Everything else, other people's opinions, their reactions, their approval or disapproval, and belongs to what he called things not up to us. He taught that the root of nearly all human suffering comes from confusing these two categories, from trying to control what was never ours to control, and neglecting what actually was. Facing the disapproval of others, really facing it, letting it land without collapsing, is one of those experiences that cannot be done by committee. You can have 100 people who love you and support you, but if there is one voice of criticism, one moment of public disapproval, one person whose respect you have lost, the internal experience of sitting with that discomfort is yours alone. No amount of reassurance from your supporters fully erases the sting of a critic's words, because the sting isn't really coming from the critic. It's coming from a part of you that has not yet made peace with being disliked, disagreed with, or misunderstood. Marcus Aurelius, as emperor, was subject to endless opinions from the Senate, from generals, from the public, from historians who would judge him for centuries after his death. He wrote something in his private journal that has become one of the most quoted lines in all of Stoic literature. He reminded himself essentially that if someone can convince him he is wrong, he should gladly change, but if no one can, he should hold his position with confidence rather than be swayed by mere criticism unaccompanied by reason. This is a remarkably mature stance. It does not say ignore all feedback. That would be arrogance, not wisdom. It says evaluate the substance, not the volume of the criticism. And that evaluation, alone, privately, using your own judgment, is a skill that has to be built through repeated practice, not inherited from someone else's confidence. Let's get practical, because I know many of you watching this are dealing with a very specific version of this pain right now. Maybe a family member who disapproves of a life choice you've made, a former friend who spread an unfair story about you, a colleague whose respect you have lost through no fault of your own, or the general diffuse anxiety of being judged by strangers on the internet. Here is what facing this alone actually looks like in practice. First, you separate the criticism from the critic's authority over your life. Ask yourself honestly, in private, is there truth in what was said that I should act on? If yes, that's valuable information, regardless of how it was delivered. If no, if the criticism is based on misunderstanding, jealousy, or values you don't share, then you are left with a choice. Continue to let this opinion occupy space in your mind, or consciously release it. That release is not something anyone else can do for you. Friends can tell you, don't worry about what they think. But until you have done the internal work of actually examining the criticism and deciding for yourself that it does not define you, the anxiety will simply resurface in a different form. Second, and this is something I think gets missed constantly in modern conversations about resilience, you have to practice being disliked in small doses before you can survive it in large ones. This means occasionally holding a position you believe in, even when it is not popular in the room. It means occasionally saying no to something, even when it disappoints someone. It means tolerating, on purpose, the small discomfort of someone being annoyed with you, rather than immediately smoothing it over to restore their approval. Each time you do this and survive it alone, without anyone rescuing you from the discomfort, you build tolerance the way a muscle builds tolerance through resistance. I think about Socrates here too. Even though he predates the Stoics, he was tried, condemned, and executed by the very city he had spent his life serving, surrounded by people who misunderstood his mission entirely. And in his final days, alone with his convictions, he chose to accept the judgment of the court rather than compromise his principles by fleeing, as his friends begged him to do. Whatever you think of his choice, the internal steadiness required to face near universal condemnation without collapsing into self-doubt is a form of strength that simply cannot be built second-hand. If you have ever felt that gnawing anxiety about what someone thinks of you, comment left unanswered in your mind for days, a look you can't stop replaying, a relationship that ended with the other person's version of events left unchallenged in the world, I want you to know that the discomfort you feel is not a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're doing something that matters, separating your sense of self from the opinions of others, one uncomfortable moment at a time. Before we move to the next one, I want to know, has there ever been a moment where you faced disapproval for standing by something you believed in and it actually made you stronger afterward? If you have a story like that, even a small one, share it in the comments. It might be exactly what someone else scrolling through today needs to read. You must face hard decisions without anyone able to make the final call for you. Every meaningful life is a sequence of decisions, and the hardest ones share a common feature. No matter how many people you consult, the actual choosing, the moment of commitment, belongs to you alone. We often try to escape this responsibility. We ask everyone we know for their opinion on a major decision, hoping that if enough people agree, the choice will somehow stop being ours to own. If it goes wrong, we can say, well, everyone told me to do it. But the Stoics would recognize this immediately for what it is, an attempt to outsource judgment, the very faculty they considered the most essential part of a human being's character. Epictetus taught that judgment, the capacity to reason clearly about what to do, is the one thing that is truly, completely ours. Not our bodies, not our reputation, not our circumstances, our judgment. And because it is ours, using it well or poorly is entirely a reflection of our own character, not the advice we received along the way. This means that even when you gather input from others, which is wise, and which the Stoics did regularly, as we see in Marcus Aurelius' own gratitude toward his teachers and advisors, the final synthesis, the final decision, has to be made by you, using your own reasoning, because you are the one who will live inside the consequences. I think about this every time I hear someone describe a major life decision by saying, I don't know what to do. Everyone has a different opinion. That statement, while understandable, often reveals a deeper avoidance. The person has not yet done the solitary work of clarifying their own values well enough to weigh those competing opinions against something solid. When you know clearly what you value, not what your parents value, not what your social circle expects, not what looks good from the outside, but what you, alone in your most honest moments, actually believe matters, hard decisions become dramatically easier to navigate, even though they remain hard. Marcus Aurelius faced enormous decisions throughout his reign, decisions about war, about succession, about how to respond to betrayal from those closest to him, including a trusted general who attempted to usurp his throne while Marcus was away. In each case, he had counselors, generals, and family members offering input. But ultimately, as emperor, the decision rested with him alone. And what steadied him through this weight was not the volume of advice he received, but the clarity of the principles he had built through years of solitary reflection. He knew, because he had examined it deeply and privately, what kind of ruler he wanted to be, just, measured, unmoved by revenge even when betrayed. That internal clarity, built alone, is what allowed him to make hard calls without being paralyzed by the noise of competing opinions. Here is something practical for anyone facing a difficult decision right now, whether it's about a relationship, a career, a move, or something else entirely. Try this exercise, alone, without discussing it with anyone first. Write down what you actually value most in this specific area of your life. Not what you think you should value, not what would look good to others. What you, in your most honest private moment, actually want your life to reflect. Then look at your decision through that lens before you gather a single outside opinion. This does not mean you should ignore good counsel. Marcus Aurelius himself credited his teachers extensively for shaping his character, but it means you enter those conversations already anchored in your own judgment, rather than using other people's opinions as a substitute for judgment you have not yet developed. There is also a quieter, more sobering side to this idea worth mentioning. Sometimes the hard decisions we face alone are not about grand life choices, but about small, daily moral choices that no one else will ever know about. Whether to be honest when a lie would be easier, whether to do the right thing when no one is watching and there would be no consequence for cutting corners. These micro-decisions, made in complete privacy, are in some ways the truest test of character, because they are made without any social pressure at all, purely on the basis of what you alone believe is right. Seneca wrote about the importance of living as though someone were always watching, not out of paranoia, but as a way of training the self to act with integrity even in genuine solitude, when literally no one is watching. If you are in the middle of a hard decision right now, and I suspect many of you watching this are, I want to leave you with this thought before we move forward. The discomfort of not knowing what to do is not a sign that you're failing at the decision. It's a sign that the decision matters. Easy decisions don't require this kind of solitary wrestling. The fact that you're wrestling means you're taking it seriously, and that seriousness, faced alone and honestly, is exactly what will lead you to a choice you can stand behind. Not because everyone told you it was right, but because you examined it yourself and found it true. If this section speaks to where you are right now, I'd encourage you to actually pause the video for a moment after this section ends and do that values exercise I just described, even just for 5 minutes. And if you're comfortable, let me know in the comments. What's one decision you're facing right now that you know deep down only you can make? You must face your own mortality. Now we arrive at the one thing every single human being who has ever lived has had to face completely alone, in the most literal sense possible: death. This might feel like a heavy turn in a video about becoming stronger, but I want you to trust me here, because this section, more than any other, is where Stoic philosophy becomes almost shockingly practical. The Stoics did not view the contemplation of death as morbid or depressing. They viewed it as the single most clarifying exercise available to a human mind, a practice they called memento mori, which translates roughly to remember that you will die. Here is why this matters so profoundly for the question of strength. Nearly every fear we carry, fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of loss, fear of taking a risk, draws its power from an unspoken assumption that we have unlimited time to fix things, to try again, to make amends, to eventually get around to living the life we actually want. Death, faced honestly, destroys that illusion, and in destroying it, it strips away an enormous amount of the fear that keeps us small. Marcus Aurelius returned to the theme of mortality constantly throughout meditations, not because he was obsessed with death in a morbid sense, but because he understood that awareness of death was the key that unlocked a more urgent, more honest relationship with life. He wrote about how quickly even the most powerful figures in history, emperors, conquerors, philosophers, are forgotten, reduced to dust and a few lines in a history book, if that. This was not meant to depress his readers. It was meant to liberate them from the exhausting pursuit of permanence, status, and legacy, and redirect their energy toward the only thing that actually matters: how they conduct themselves today, in this life right now. Here is the part that connects directly to everything we've discussed in this video. The confrontation with your own mortality is an experience that cannot be shared. Other people can be present when you're dying, and many people are fortunate enough to be surrounded by loved ones in their final moments. But the internal experience of facing the end of your own existence, of reckoning with what your life has meant, of coming to terms with what you did and didn't do with the time you had, that reckoning happens in a place no other consciousness can enter. Seneca wrote extensively about this, arguing that most people don't actually fear death itself so much as they fear reaching the end. without having truly lived, without having faced their own life honestly while there was still time to change course. This is why the Stoics practiced memento mori, not as a one-time confrontation, reserved for the deathbed, but as a regular, almost daily discipline. The idea was to bring the awareness of mortality into ordinary moments, not to create anxiety, but to create urgency and gratitude. When Marcus Aurelius embraced his children, part of him held the awareness that this embrace, like everything else, was temporary. This did not make him love them less. If anything, it made him love them with a fuller presence, because he was not taking the moment for granted, assuming there would always be another one exactly like it. I want to walk you through a practice here, one that might feel uncomfortable at first, but which I genuinely believe could change how you experience the rest of this year, maybe the rest of your life. Find 5 minutes alone without distraction, and honestly imagine the end of your life, not in a morbid, spiraling way, but in a clear, sober way. Ask yourself, if I knew with certainty that I had 1 year left, what would I stop doing? What would I start doing? What relationship would I repair? What fear would suddenly seem small and irrelevant compared to the shortness of the time remaining? Sit with these questions honestly. Don't perform the answers for anyone else. This exercise only works if you are completely truthful with yourself in private, without an audience shaping what you're willing to admit. What most people discover when they do this exercise honestly is startling in its simplicity. The things they've been afraid to do, the career change, the difficult conversation, the pursuit of a dream they've been postponing, suddenly seem far less frightening when weighed against the certainty of death. And the things they've been taking for granted, time with people they love, ordinary mornings, simple pleasures, suddenly seem far more precious. This is the strange gift hidden inside mortality. It is the great equalizer of fear. Once you have genuinely faced the fact that you will die, and that no one can face that fact for you, other fears begin to shrink in comparison. The fear of embarrassment, the fear of failure, the fear of what someone might think of you. These all draw their power from an assumption of infinite time to recover from them. Death, faced honestly, reveals that time is not infinite, and in doing so, it often gives people the courage to finally act on what actually matters to them. I know this section may have brought up something heavy for some of you, and I don't say any of this lightly. If you've lost someone, or if you're dealing with your own mortality in a very real and immediate way right now, please know that this reflection is meant to honor the seriousness of what you're carrying, not minimize it. If you're comfortable, I'd invite you to share in the comments. Has facing mortality, your own or someone else's, ever clarified what actually matters to you? I think these stories help more people than we realize. You must face uncertainty and change without knowing how the story ends. There is a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from living inside uncertainty, a job situation that hasn't resolved, a relationship whose future is unclear, a health concern awaiting answers, a major life transition with no guaranteed outcome. Uncertainty is uncomfortable precisely because the human mind craves resolution, and it will often manufacture anxious stories just to escape the discomfort of not knowing. Here is something the Stoics understood with remarkable clarity. Uncertainty is not actually a temporary condition that resolves once you get enough information. Uncertainty is the permanent condition of being alive. We simply don't notice it most of the time because we've built comfortable illusions of control and predictability around our daily routines. It takes a crisis, a sudden job loss, an unexpected diagnosis, a relationship ending without warning, to reveal how little control we actually had all along. Epictetus's entire philosophy rests on this recognition. He taught that clinging to certainty about things outside our control, the future, other people's choices, the outcomes of our efforts, is the direct cause of most human anxiety. His solution was not to pretend uncertainty doesn't exist, but to relocate our sense of security away from external outcomes and toward our own internal responses. He famously used the metaphor of an archer. The archer trains diligently, aims carefully, and releases the arrow with full effort and skill. But whether the wind shifts, whether the target moves, whether the arrow actually lands where intended, is beyond the archer's control. The archer's job is to release the arrow well. What happens after release belongs to forces outside them. This reframing is powerful, but I want to be honest with you. Living it out is genuinely difficult, and it requires a kind of solitary courage that no external reassurance can substitute for. When you are lying awake at night, uncertain about whether a decision you made was the right one, uncertain about how a situation will resolve, no amount of a friend telling you it'll work out actually removes the discomfort of not knowing. That discomfort has to be metabolized internally through a genuine shift in how you relate to uncertainty itself, not through distraction and not through borrowed optimism that doesn't reflect your own honest assessment. Marcus Aurelius ruled during one of the most uncertain periods in Roman history. A devastating plague swept through the empire, likely killing millions, including members of his own family, while simultaneous wars threatened the empire's borders on multiple fronts. He had no way of knowing on any given day whether the empire would survive, whether he would survive, whether his choices as emperor were the right ones. And yet, in Meditations, we see him returning again and again to a strategy that modern psychology would recognize as remarkably sound, focusing entirely on what was within his control in the present moment. His own conduct, his own judgment, his own response, rather than exhausting himself trying to predict or control an uncertain future. I want to give you a practical way to work with this, because focus on what you can control can become an empty platitude if it's not applied concretely. The next time you feel the anxious grip of uncertainty about something significant in your life, try this exercise alone. Take a piece of paper and draw a line down the middle. On one side, write down every aspect of the situation that is genuinely outside your control: other people's decisions, timing, external circumstances, outcomes you cannot guarantee. On the other side, write down what is actually within your control: your effort, your preparation, your attitude, your next action. Then, consciously, direct your mental energy only toward the second column. This does not eliminate uncertainty. Nothing can eliminate uncertainty because it is woven into the fabric of existence. But it changes your relationship to it, transforming anxious helplessness into focused, purposeful action within the boundaries of what is actually yours to influence. There's another dimension to this worth naming honestly: change itself. Even positive change carries a kind of grief and uncertainty that we rarely acknowledge. Starting a new chapter of life, a new city, a new relationship, a new career, means letting go of a familiar identity, even one that wasn't serving you well. That letting go, that stepping into the unknown version of yourself, cannot be done by anyone else on your behalf. Friends can encourage you toward change. They cannot actually become the new version of you that the change requires. That becoming happens alone, through the accumulation of small, private choices that no one else witnesses in the moment they're made. I think of Seneca's exile again here, because it's such a vivid example of forced, unwanted change met with eventual strength. He did not choose to lose his status, his community, his familiar life in Rome. But faced with that uncertainty, alone on Corsica with no guarantee of ever returning, he did the internal work of building a new relationship to his circumstances, not through denial, but through the deliberate, solitary practice of philosophy applied to his actual pain. By the time he was eventually recalled to Rome, he returned not as a broken man, but as someone whose understanding of what actually mattered had been deepened by the very uncertainty he'd been forced to face. If you are currently living inside uncertainty about something big in your life, I want you to hear this clearly. The discomfort you feel is not a sign that something is wrong with you or your situation. It is simply what it feels like to be a conscious being, confronting the honest unpredictability of existence. You are not failing at handling uncertainty by finding it hard. You are simply experiencing what every human being who has ever lived through genuine uncertainty has experienced, and like them, you have the capacity built through solitary practice to meet it with steadiness rather than panic. Before we move to the final and, I think, most important section of this video, tell me in the comments, what is one area of uncertainty in your life right now where you could apply that control versus not control exercise? Sometimes just naming it publicly, even to strangers on the internet, makes the private work of facing it feel a little less overwhelming. You must face the person you are becoming. We have arrived at the 9th thing, the one I promised you at the very beginning of this video, and I meant it when I said this might be the most important thing we cover today, because it is, in many ways, the thread that ties every previous section together. Here it is. You must face, honestly and alone, the person you are actually becoming. Not the person you present to others, not the curated version visible on social media, not the story you tell at dinner parties, but the actual trajectory of your character, built through thousands of small, private choices that no one else will ever fully see. This is different from facing a single failure, or a single fear, or a single decision. This is about facing the cumulative pattern, who you have quietly, gradually become through the accumulation of everything we've discussed today. How you've handled silence, how you've processed failure, how you've moved through grief, how you've responded to fear, how you've related to others' opinions, how you've made hard decisions, how you've held the awareness of your mortality, how you've met uncertainty. All of it adds up day after day into a character, and at some point, usually in a quiet moment, much like the ones we've discussed throughout this video, you have to sit alone and honestly ask, is this who I actually want to be? Epictetus taught that philosophy is not primarily about acquiring knowledge. It is about the transformation of character through consistent practice. He compared it to the difference between a sheep and a wolf. A sheep does not vomit up grass to show the shepherd how much it has eaten. Instead, it digests the food internally, and the proof is in the wool and the milk it produces. Similarly, he argued, a person should not perform their philosophical understanding for others to see, but should digest their principles internally until they show up naturally in how they actually live, especially when no one is watching. This is perhaps the purest expression of what it means to face who you're becoming alone. The true test is not what you say about yourself to others, but who you are in the completely private moments where no audience exists to witness or validate your choices. Marcus Aurelius, near the end of his life, wrote something in Meditations that I think about often. He reminded himself that a person's worth is measured by the things they set their heart upon, and he worried, honestly and privately, about whether the pursuits that occupied his days actually reflected the values he claimed to hold. This kind of honest self-audit, conducted not for an audience, not for a performance review, not to impress anyone, but purely as a private reckoning with his own conscience, is available to every single one of us, and it is perhaps the single most powerful practice discussed in this entire video. Here is why I saved this for last, and why I think it deserves your full attention, even if you're tired after everything we've covered, every other kind of solitary strength we've discussed, facing silence, facing failure, facing grief, facing fear, facing judgment, facing decisions, facing mortality, facing uncertainty is, in the end, in service of this 9th and final confrontation. Because if you build the capacity to face all of these things honestly, alone, without needing an audience to soften or validate the process, what you are actually building, brick by brick, is a self you can trust. A character that holds up under pressure, not because other people believe in it, but because you have tested it yourself, privately, repeatedly, and found it to be genuine. This is what the Stoics meant when they talked about virtue as the only true good. Not virtue as a performance for others' approval, but virtue as an internal architecture, built through solitary practice, that remains standing regardless of who is watching, regardless of what praise or criticism comes your way, regardless of whether anyone else ever knows the private battles. You've won to become who you are. I want to offer you a final practice, one that draws together everything we've discussed today. Once a week, perhaps on a Sunday evening, perhaps whenever you can find 20 quiet minutes alone, sit with a journal and ask yourself these questions honestly, with no audience, no performance, just you and the truth. Who am I becoming through my daily choices? Is the direction I'm heading actually aligned with what I say I value? What have I been avoiding facing that I know, deep down, I need to face? This practice, repeated over months and years, is how a person slowly becomes strong in the truest sense, not through a single dramatic transformation, but through the accumulation of thousands of honest, private moments where they chose to face themselves rather than run from what they found there. I think about all 9 of these confrontations: silence, failure, grief, fear, judgment, decisions, mortality, uncertainty, and finally, the ongoing question of who you're becoming. And I realize they all share one common thread. Every single one of them at some point strips away the crowd and leaves you standing with only yourself for company. And here is the beautiful, difficult truth the Stoics understood 2,000 years ago, and that remains just as true today. That aloneness is not a punishment. It is not a gap to be filled with noise and distraction. It is the exact place where your strength is forged, tested, and ultimately proven, not to anyone else, but to the only person whose opinion of you will matter for the rest of your life: yourself. We've walked through 9 doors today, and behind every single one of them, you found the same figure standing alone: you. The silence of your own mind, the unglamorous reality of your failures, the isolating weight of grief, the private battlefield of fear, the sting of others' opinions, the solitary weight of decisions only you can make, the unavoidable fact of your own mortality, the permanent condition of uncertainty, and finally, the ongoing question of who you are quietly becoming, one private choice at a time. If there is one thing I hope you carry away from this video, it is this: the fact that you must face these things alone is not evidence that you are unsupported, unloved, or abandoned. It is simply the nature of being a conscious, responsible human being living a real life. Marcus Aurelius had an empire's worth of advisors and still had to write to himself in the dark. Seneca had powerful friends and still had to face exile, and later his own death, with only his own philosophy to steady him. Epictetus began with nothing, not even ownership of his own body, and built, alone, an inner fortress that outlasted his chains by 2,000 years and counting. You have that same capacity within you, right now, whatever you are facing. Not because you are already strong, none of us start there, but because the very act of facing these 9 things honestly, repeatedly, over time, is what strength actually is. It is not a trait some people are born with and others are not. It is a muscle built exactly the way we've discussed today, in solitude, through practice, through the willingness to sit with discomfort instead of fleeing from it. If this video gave you something today, a new way of thinking about a fear you're carrying, a bit of comfort in a grief you're facing, a nudge toward a decision you've been avoiding, I would genuinely love for you to consider subscribing to Wisdom of the Stoics. We publish content like this regularly, walking through the practical, applicable wisdom of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus, translated for the actual struggles of modern life. And if you know someone in your life who is facing one of these 9 things right now, grief, fear, a hard decision, uncertainty about the future, consider sharing this video with them. Sometimes the most caring thing you can do for someone facing something alone is not to try to fix it for them, but to hand them the tools to face it with strength. Before you go, leave a comment, letting me know which of these 9 things hit you the hardest today. Was it the silence, the failure, the grief, the fear, the mortality? I read every single comment, And I promise you, whatever you write, someone else scrolling through these comments tomorrow will read it too, and it might be exactly what they needed to hear. Remember what Marcus Aurelius wrote to himself, alone in a tent on a battlefield, nearly 2,000 years ago. Words meant for no one but himself, and yet somehow meant for every single one of us watching this today. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Until next time, stay strong, stay grounded, and remember, you were built for exactly this.